All right, good evening, everybody. We will go ahead and begin our webinar. Thank you for joining us this evening for Seeking Shelter, Changes in Housing Preferences, brought to you by the Center for Real Estate Entrepreneurship at the George Mason School of Business. My name is Eric Maribojek. I'm the director for the Center for Real Estate Entrepreneurship. For those of you that don't know us, we are George Mason's platform for real estate education and programming, and we appreciate your participation today. So Seeking Shelter, changes in housing preferences. Our housing choices, where and how we live, are definitely changing. The pandemic experience, affordability, shifting work patterns, transportation preferences, and environmental concerns are impacting the different housing decisions of retiring baby boomers, maturing millennials, and the new Gen Z generation of home buyers. These are critical issues for real estate professionals, for those that plan, build, and market residential real estate, as well as for housing consumers. Before we proceed, I'd like to thank the leading real estate companies and organizations that support the Center for Real Estate Entrepreneurship in our mission to bring real estate education to the metropolitan DC area. I'd like to thank Buchanan Partners, Peterson Companies, Equinox Companies, NV Commercial, Van Meter Group, Stanley Martin Homes, NAIOP Northern Virginia, Trammell Crow Company, Davis Construction, Skanska Development, the law firm of Walsh, Colucci, Lubele, and Walsh, Bowman Consulting, Eagle Bank, Christopher Companies, Lassard Design, Capital One, Shirley Contracting Company, ECS Mid-Atlantic, Baker Tilly, and the Fairfax County Office of Planning and Development. If you're interested in supporting real estate education and programming at George Mason University, please email me at the email below your screen. So tonight, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Dr. Jessica Lautz, the Vice President of Demographics and Behavioral Insights at the National Association of Realtors. Jessica's research focuses on analyzing trends for both NAR members and housing consumers. Through management of surveys, focus groups, and data analysis, she presents new and innovative ways to showcase results and discusses her research in major media outlets and national presentations. In 2021, she was named one of Housing Wire's Women of Influence, a list representing 100 of the most influential women in leadership in the housing industry. Just a reminder, we are recording this presentation and an email will be sent with the link to all those that registered. We will also have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to write your questions, and there will be a moderated discussion of your questions after that. So without further ado, I'll turn over the screen to Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited and truly honored to be joining the presentation tonight. And I know that I'm seeing some friendly names actually in the participant group. So I'm excited to see Realtor friends here joining as well and folks from NVAR. So thank you so much for sharing and promoting this webinar as well. And excited to answer any questions that pop up. So let me dive in. We are certainly in a very interesting environment right now in the housing market. There is a lot of demand in the housing market, and I think that there currently is this pretty mad dash to actually lock in a low mortgage rate before mortgage rates are expected to increase. And we're seeing a lot of demand from millennials right now. I'm going to go through some of those changing demographics, but let's take a landscape look about what is going on in the housing market right now. When we see this housing market, what we see is that we really have a very strong lack of housing inventory. We actually have under 1 million units right now available on the market. That is the lowest level that we actually have recorded back to 1999 when we first started recording that data at NAR. It means that there's about 1.8 months supply, which is a very, very low level in a very fast moving market. Some estimates say that we need about 6.5 months if we look at this to have a balanced market. So really, we have a very strong seller's market today. And we know that sellers are receiving really anything that they put on the market. They really are getting their asking price for that home, if not having a number of buyers actually line up and say, I'm willing to lock in that home and actually have that successful contract accepted. We see right now that there are double-digit home price increases, and this is not just a coastal phenomenon anymore. We certainly are seeing this in the DC area and the DMV. But if we look across markets across the country, what we're actually seeing is that in 99% of the markets that we're tracking, there's year-over-year home price growth. And I think that's what makes this market so extraordinary, is really seeing how far-reaching this home price increase is across the country. When we look pre-pandemic, 2019 to today, what we know is that home prices have actually increased 30%. While at the same time, there has been a 60% reduction in inventory. So really seeing these two issues coming head to head as we see a number of consumers jump into the market and say, I had no expectation of purchasing a home in the coming years, but with COVID, this has changed what I actually need out of my home. And maybe that's a home office or two home offices or a room for kids to Zoom school in. Perhaps that's just a place with a bigger yard where they can grow their own vegetables and then cook them in their brand new kitchen. So we really do see that people need a different space. We also see a lot of movement across the country into more affordable markets. So we see that move to the suburbs, we see the move to small towns, and I'll go through some of that data. But what I find very interesting right now is that we actually see more young adults, more younger millennials who are actually purchasing in small towns rather than urban areas at this point. And some of that has to do with affordability, and some of it has to do with the inventory that's available. But the third reason that's out there is the proximity to friends and family. We see that support systems have really redefined themselves in the last 2 years, and people really need their community around them in a different way than they had before. Maybe that's grandparents helping out with grandkids while parents are working and someone needs to watch a kid who's Zoom schooling. Maybe that means making sure that that elderly relative is actually safe because of the pandemic and not living independently. But whatever that reason is, family has really changed where people are moving. With all of this movement, what we see is that there are consecutive year-over-year home price increases, and now we've hit 118 months of consecutive year-over-year home price increases. When we look at this market, it is no surprise that homes are moving incredibly fast, but I think it's really important to look at this on a historical perspective. What we see today is that homes are moving in just 1 week, and that is the lowest amount of time that we actually have ever recorded, back to 1989. At the height, we can see that coming out of the Great Recession, there was an influx of homes on the market. There was plenty of supply, even though we had the first-time homebuyer tax credit that brought a lot of first-time homebuyers into the market. We saw that homes were moving in 11 weeks. So a pretty extended period of time if we look at that historically. In the most recent years, we know that all of the same COVID issues were happening in the last 2 years, but we saw that when we look at this last year, homes were moving in 3 weeks. So you can see a pretty big dip here of the lack of inventory and the increased demand in the market. And I'm going to show you why there's such an increased demand right now and why we can really underscore that. When we look at the amount of what the sales price compared to the listing prices, sellers are incredibly happy because whatever they're offering on their for their home, they're really getting that. It's 100%. That's the highest ratio that we actually have ever recorded when we look at that back to 2002. And even when we saw this frenzied market condition during the boom years, we know that homes were not actually selling at that price point before that percent of list price. There's really no negotiation that buyer can have. We actually know that about a quarter of homes can pretty consistently over the last year are waiving the appraisal. They're waiving the home inspection. They're really not negotiating because even right now in the dead of winter, when traditionally we would not really see that many buyers in the market and you wouldn't see that much activity, what we see is that there's actually 3.8 offers for every listing that's out there. So a third of the listings that are out there, they're moving for more than asking price. And it's really a pretty fast moving market that are willing to have multiple bids and beat up that price. So cash offers. This is a huge trend in this market right now. I talked about waiving the appraisal and waiving the home inspection. And one of those reasons is probably because people are paying all cash. And what we see, these are beautiful vacation homes that are shown in this picture here, and that's intentional. When we look at the vacation home market, we know that there's a lot of people who have had a lot of cash and they have saved in the last couple of years. It's not true for everyone. And we certainly know that this is a K-shaped pandemic. It's a K-shaped economy right now, where a lot of people have had hours cut. They haven't been able to work full time in this environment, but a lot of people have really cut spending on entertainment and going out and sporting events and luxury vacations. And they've decided, I want a domestic vacation property instead. When we look at vacation properties that are being purchased, half of them are all cash. So there's a lot of people who can actually move into affordable markets, perhaps Zoom from there and do hybrid work schedules from those vacation homes and actually pay all cash for those properties. When we look at the primary residence market, there's actually a lot of all cash buyers there as well. So this chart right here is looking only at primary residence buyers. And what we see is that 17% of the market who are repeat buyers in the market are actually paying all cash as well. So that's an elevated share from what we have seen historically. And again, that speaks to people moving to more affordable areas, but it also speaks to the amount of savings that people have had really checked up. What we do see as well, and what I think is really interesting, is that there certainly are new companies that are coming into this space. And they're saying, okay, there's a lot of competition for homes right now. There's 3 to 4 offers right now in the dead of winter, when traditionally you would not see that type of competition for homes. And to actually be able to move into homes right now, you need to be able to have a pretty solid offer. And a solid offer right now may be all cash. So these companies have come in and it's essentially acting as if it's an all cash transaction, but it's not an all cash transaction. And so we see that type of activity as well. Essentially, they're promising that company that they will actually finance that purchase after they're in that home, after they get the keys and they've walked in the door. And that's a change from what we have seen in the past. These companies are popping up, allowing that to happen right now in this market. So I do apologize. I'm in the DC office right now at the NAR, and our office is right across from a fire station. And I guess right now there's just a lot of activity. I have actually never seen this come up in Zoom before, but it actually says, do I want to play music? And I do not. No one wants to hear siren music. So I'm very sorry if that's picking up in the microphone. All right, so I do want to talk about this uneven recovery. We have certainly seen this throughout the pandemic, but we have continued to see this coming out of the Great Recession as well, where some individuals can enter homeownership and have been able to enter homeownership and have the wealth gains that homeownership provides, while others have had a very difficult time doing so. The pandemic has exacerbated this. Housing affordability and inventory has also exacerbated this issue. And I want to show you some state level data, and then I want to show you the experience based on race of entering homeownership. And this really looks at successful buyers as well. So let's take a look at some of these maps here. What's really important is when we look at the white homeownership rate compared to the Black homeownership rate or the Hispanic homeownership rate, what we know right now is that on the good side, the Hispanic homeownership rate is actually ticking upwards. If we look at the Black compared to the white homeownership rate, what we know is that there is about a 30 percentage point spread. And that homeownership rate gap is as wide as when the Fair Housing Act started back in 1968. So there's a lot of reasons behind that statement of why that gap is so persistent. We actually know that the Black homeownership rate actually did increase during the boom years, but then we know that Black individuals and Hispanic individuals disproportionately lost their homes during the Great Recession. They really have not come back to homeownership as they had been in the market in the boom years. When we look at the homeownership rate and we look at this on a state level, I think it becomes really important. It can really bring this home. When we look, at Virginia, we can see that for white Virginians, the homeownership rate is at 72%. I'm also going to pick on North Dakota. I'm hoping that I don't think that anyone would be zooming in from North Dakota on here, but I do think it's one that really does display how wide this gap is. We can also call out California here. We know that California has a lot of affordability issues. It's a beautiful place to live, but there's a lot of people who want to live there, and it's very hard to enter into homeownership. So if we look at California, we can see that their homeownership rate for white individuals within the state, white Californians, is 59%. So just picking out those 3 states. If we look at the Hispanic homeownership rate, what we can see is that there are considerable differences here. So again, going back to home state of Virginia, we can see that the homeownership rate is 50% there for Hispanic individuals. In North Dakota, 23%. So that gap is very wide within North Dakota. In California, even though we have a disproportionately larger share of Hispanic Latino individuals within the state of California, we actually have a pretty low homeownership rate, actually lower than Virginia at 44%. But we know overall the homeownership rate in that state is lower as well, just because of the affordability constraints and the lack of inventory within that state. When we go in and we look at the homeownership rate for Black individuals, what we can see is that there are also considerable differences. So my lights are actually timed here, so I need to do more movement as I do my presentation, I suppose. As we look here, we can see that in North Dakota, the Black homeownership rate is just 5%. Within the state of Virginia, 47%. So we're taking down lower than the Hispanic and considerably lower than the white homeownership rate on both counts. And then in the state of Virginia, or in California, it's at 36%. So again, measurable declines from what we had seen from the Hispanic and the white homeownership rates in each one of those respective states. But I think what we can call out here is that North Dakota is certainly the lowest when we do this apples to apples comparison. Now, within each of these states, there's certainly headwinds that each one of these populations is facing to enter homeownership. We were just chatting before this presentation, and for a first-time home buyer to be able to enter into homeownership, very, very hard for them today to compete against those all-cash buyers, to compete against married couples if perhaps they're a single, would be very hard to enter into homeownership. And we know that everyone is encountering these issues, but it is more pronounced, especially for the Black African American and the Hispanic Latino populations. So I do want to show some data on what successful home buyers encountered when we do look at this by race. What we can see here is that for African American home buyers, for Black home buyers, they are more likely to have student loan debt compared to white home buyers. And this is among successful home buyers who did enter into homeownership in the last year. In fact, double the amount actually do have student loan debt. We can also see that Black individuals who are home buyers who successfully purchased a home, they are more likely to be single income households than both white individuals who purchased homes and more likely than Hispanic individuals who purchased homes. We also see, and this is, I think, where it gets really interesting, that Black individuals who purchased homes, they are substantially more likely to actually be single female buyers. And why that matters at the end of the day, we know that single female buyers overall are purchasing homes on a lower household income in comparison to single men. They actually are more active in the market if we look at all races, especially among first-time home buyers, but they're making more financial sacrifices to be able to enter homeownership. They have to save for a longer period of time. They have to cut spending in other areas of their life because they have lower household incomes. So they may be purchasing a lower priced home, but there's even fewer of those homes that are available in the market. We also know that Black individuals who purchased homes are more likely to be purchasing multi-generational homes. And they are equally likely as Hispanic Latino buyers. And why this matters, why it could be a good thing and why it could be a bad thing. So on the positive, if we have multiple income earners within that household, so you perhaps have a young adult who is boomeranged back home, perhaps you have a senior who's thinking about retirement or working part-time, and everyone's contributing to those household expenses, to the utilities, and is also contributing to that mortgage, that could be a very positive thing within that household. However, perhaps you have a single mom who has a young adult who is in college and they're not working full-time. They can't financially contribute. or you have a retired senior also living in that home, that would be quite difficult for that senior to be contributing to those household expenses as well. So that could be a drain on that single mom who's trying to purchase that home and really be that stable household for everyone who's living there. We also know, and this is where I think it becomes really important as well, is where do you get your down payment? And what we can see is that for African-American home buyers, they are actually very likely to tap their 401k, their retirement fund. In fact, 1 in 6 of those home buyers actually did tap their 401k to be able to purchase a home. And in doing so, that can be a very positive thing because they entered homeownership, they were able to find that savings, they were able to actually have the wealth gains that homeownership provides. However, on the flip side, that could be further eroding the wealth gains that they could have had from their 401k as well. When we look at white home buyers, when we look at other races of home buyers, what we do see is that they're more likely to actually have the ability to have a wealth transfer, perhaps from parents through a gift or loan, and that helps them enter homeownership. And that's just not available to many Black African-American home buyers. And so that gap is certainly one of the many reasons why we could see this lower homeownership rate. The other thing that we are seeing here, and where I think it becomes especially disturbing when we look at the data, is just the denial rate for mortgages for successful home buyers. And when we look at Black home buyers, what we see is that their denial rate is 2.5 times what it is for white home buyers who successfully purchased a home. So even though they were able to qualify for a purchase, even though their debt to income ratio was high enough and they had enough savings in the bank, they still were denied from a mortgage. And so I think this is where it becomes incredibly important to really dig in and see what that experience is, even for successful home buyers. So the question here is, why in the world does all this matter? Well, it is the number one way that we build wealth in the US is really through our nest egg of homeownership. When we do look at this, what we see is for white individuals, for families who are white, they have a net worth of more than $188,000. And when we look at that for Black individuals, what we see is that they have a net worth of just $24,000. And that gap of net worth has actually widened over time. And much of that net worth really has to do with homeownership and the nest egg that is built in the home. If we just look at a home buyer, and this is regardless of race, who purchased a home 10 years ago, what we actually know is that their net worth, the equity that they have earned just in their home in the last 10 years is $225,000. And when we think about the homeownership or of home prices increasing by 30% since 2019, we know that there is a lot of net worth and a lot of wealth gains that can be had through homeownership. And we really do know that that is being lost if we see that gap continue to widen. All right, so if we look at this gap and we just look at the net worth of owners versus renters, what we know is that that gap has widened over time as well. What is not displayed on this chart is actually what we have calculated at NAR, is that that gap has now widened by 37 times the net worth for owners versus renters. And truly, almost on an every month basis, you can see that gap likely widening over time because it's not reflective of current home prices. So this is using the Federal Reserve data. And what we know is that based on 2019 home prices, that's certainly not reflective of today's home prices and net worth that would be held within one's home. All right, so I am going to move on topics here and talk about just how quick this home search process has become. We know that technology has really changed the home buying process, the home search process in the last few years, as realtors have really tried to make the home search process and the home buying process safe from COVID. But we also know that one of the big changes that has happened is the lack of inventory. So you can't see something that's actually not available to buy. And so you can't go through an open house if there really is not that available inventory in the market. So in looking at just the number of weeks and the number of homes that have been viewed, we can really see some pretty big differences here over time. So looking at this data historically, what we see is that today people are just searching for homes for 8 weeks. Now, they could be dreaming of homes. They could be certainly sending listings to friends for an extended period of time. perhaps years as they're dreaming. I know there was an SNL skit that was pretty fun and really just displayed what I think many of us have done during the pandemic and really just dreamed of a beautiful home with a beautiful pool or hot tub or whatever feature that we really want and are thinking about, and we're sending it to friends. What we know, though, when the search really gets down to it, is that people are searching for homes for about 8 weeks. And this is a legit search at this point. Once they're pre-qualified and they're ready to go for a mortgage. One of the other things that we know is that the number of homes that people are viewing has declined as well. So they're just searching for just 8 homes that they're physically viewing. And some of these homes, they may not actually be physically viewing at all. In fact, some of these homes, they may only be seeing online and just searching online for properties. So it really has changed the home buying process if we looked at just what has happened in the last couple of years. We know that a lot of people are taking advantage of technology and using these virtual tours and these virtual listings and really relying on their agent, especially if they're moving at farther distances and they don't feel comfortable jumping on a flight as well. All right. So let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, millennials. I do think this is incredibly important when we look at homeownership and when we look at the market and how it's going to be moving forwards. So if we look at the homeownership rate for those who are under the age of 35, and we compare this for those who are the same age. So let me walk you through this chart. What we're looking at here is the homeownership rate for older boomers when they were under the age of 35 on the far spectrum in 1982, compared in apples to apples to millennials under the age of 35. So we're not counting all millennials in this data here, but those who are under the age of 35 in the most recent years. And so it's essentially an apples to apples comparison. We can say, okay, when I was your age, essentially, what are we looking at for a homeownership rate? Because I think that gets lost a lot. Unless you're looking at memes, it really does get lost of what it is that we're looking at for an apples to apples comparison of when I was your age, it wasn't this hard. Well, truly it was not. When we look at the homeownership rate for today's young adults, what we can see is that the highest their homeownership rate has been is 36.7%. When we compare that over time, it really only compares to Gen Xers coming out of the Great Recession. And I think this is where it becomes really important. For Gen Xers, their homeownership rate was as high as 43% of them actually owned a home. So truly a very different scenario. For older boomers, 41% of them at the height owned a home. So really they had an easier time entering homeownership rate, regardless of what the interest rates were. Housing affordability was just not as tough for these individuals when they entered into the homeownership. What becomes really important for real estate and for realtors out there, for businesses, if we look at the population by age. What we're looking at here on this chart is just the number of millions of adults in each, or millions of individuals within each age category. So we're looking at the young pandemic babies that were born this year who are less than 1 year old in the furthest green bar, all the way to the centenarians. And you can see this trailing off with mortality rates. You can see the bars getting shorter. This red bar is where it becomes really important. That is the median age of first-time homebuyers today. That's 33 years old. In the bars right behind it, you can see that there's more of them than anyone else in any other age category. And there is actually about 24 million young adults who are aged between 28 and 32. And that is the biggest population in the US right now, period, hands down. Why that becomes really important is that that's the median age of a first-time home buyer. What we have traditionally seen for the last 40 years is that it has ranged between 28 and 33, and it really has not budged much from that range. So if you have a young adult who's at home, or a young adult who perhaps is your kid, or you're a young adult on this call and you're itching for homeownership in that age range, that is not unusual. That's generally where those young adults want to enter into homeownership. What becomes really important is that those young adults may not be mortgage ready. They may not be ready to own a home at this exact moment, but that is certainly in sight of what they would probably like to do. What becomes even more important is just the lack of inventory that we have right now and how this really could become an issue if we think about this moving forward just for the next few years and the lack of inventory that we have. By NAR's estimates, we are short 4.5 million to 6.7 million units in the US. And so that's really not going to be able to accommodate all of these young adults. And say we have a homeownership rate that is similar to what it has been for the last few years for these young adults, we're still not going to have enough units to actually be able to accommodate all of these individuals. So the yellow are baby boomers here. And we can see that mortality rates, we see this line trailing off. But what is important is that for baby boomers and for Gen Xers who are on this line here, they're home buyers. And we can actually see that they are living in their current property for a longer period of time. What I'm showing you on this chart here is just the median age of home buyers. So for first-time home buyers, like I said, between 28 and 32, and really boring and flat. Where it becomes really important, and when we think about housing inventory, is this green bar. This is the median age of a repeat buyer today. And it's jumped considerably. It's actually a really striking data point because we can see the median age of a repeat buyer back in 1981 was just 36 years old. And today in the most recent year, it's now 56 years old. And as this has risen, what we have seen is that people are staying in their homes longer, they're living longer, they're working longer, they're feeling very confident at 56 years old, locking in that 30-year fixed mortgage. Maybe they're paying all cash for their home, but we can see that about 80% of them, more than 80% are not. They are taking on a mortgage later in life, and they have no intention of leaving that home. And so that's really going to crunch down on to the available inventory as well, because they really don't have any intention of moving. They were saying that's my forever home. I'm here to stay put. So whether the intention is the reality, that's probably not necessarily true for a lot of these people. They could move with a life change. They could move. Perhaps they have a job change later in life. That absolutely can happen. But they are saying that this is probably where I'm staying for the foreseeable future, at least. One of the things that's important when we talk about the young adults out there is the first-time homebuyer share. And what we can see is that there was a slight uptick this year in first-time homebuyers. It's really not a surprise when we just look at that wave of young adults who are out there. It actually ticked upwards from 31% to 34% in the most recent year. What has changed in the most recent year is not just that wave of population who's aging into their first-time homebuyer year. It's also important to look at familial health, family health. And I mentioned that when we were talking that in the context of race, but it is important to note when we look at this data that the share of first-time homebuyers who actually did have family help did increase in the most recent iteration of the data. And so there's actually more young adults who were able to have down payment gift or a loan, maybe not fair market loan from their friends or relatives, and that may have pushed them into homeownership. That 50% mark there, that's the first-time homebuyer tax credit. It was back in 2008, 2010. It was about $8,500, the last iteration of it, and it did push a lot of first-time homebuyers into the market. That 30% mark, that's important to call out too, because that's actually back when we were in the midst of a recession in the 1980s. We had double-digit interest rates, and first-time homebuyers really had a difficult time entering in the market. If I look back at the hard copy reports that we have from that time period, what we can see is that people were encountering higher home prices with these double-digit interest rates, and they were having a very hard time entering homeownership. So that was a difficult time for first-time homebuyers, but for different reasons out there today than what we see today. All right, so one of the arguments that's out there is, and I will try and dispel this here, that young adults are wasting all their money on blowing all their money on the avocado toast meme. They're blowing all their money on transportation and fancy cars. They're getting the Teslas out there or something along those lines. It's just not true. And so I wanted to try and dispel this myth by looking at BLS consumer spending data and essentially go back down and do the exact same thing as I did with the homeownership rate data and say, well, when I was your age, I didn't spend as much on X, Y, and Z. Maybe that's entertainment, maybe that's going out to eat, so on. When looking at this data, what we can see is that's just not true. We actually can see a very disproportionate amount of younger millennials today, when they're under the age of 25, are spending more on housing. 35% of their income is being spent on housing compared to younger boomers when they were the same age, when they're spending just 29% on housing. We can also see that there is actually a jump in education. So maybe those student loan debt bills are not due yet because you're under the age of 25, but maybe they are coming due, or maybe they're trying to cover some of their spending on education right now and spending it out of pocket. And we can actually see that there's an increased share of that as well. What actually has gone down is transportation cost. That has actually declined over time for different generations. So perhaps using more public transit or rideshare services and less likely to actually spend on buying a brand new car. So I think we can dispel that myth right away. The other one that actually has stayed flat or gone down is really just going out to eat and spending out food outside of home, and also apparel and services. So those things have actually declined in spending for younger generations. So all of the memes, not necessarily true, that are out there. One of the things that has definitely been happening is young adults have boomeranged home during the pandemic. We have seen that that has actually increased. In last year, it increased to the highest share recorded for those who are 25 to 34, all the way up to 17.8%. That really is the highest share that census data has since the 1960s. In the last year, this did decline to 17%. So slight downtick, I would say, in the last year. That being said, what we know is that a lot of young adults, this is a great way to save money. We also are able to actually look at this and see that people, when they moved home, maybe it's because of a job loss that disproportionately happened for young adults. Maybe it's because of cut spending. Maybe it's because school went online and they didn't have to actually pay for a dorm or living on college campus or renting. Maybe it's because they moved out of city centers and they were actually able to rent an apartment. Instead of renting an apartment and paying increasingly high rents that they're encountering today, they were able to move home. And so we did see this uptick for whatever reason is out there. But for these young adults who did move home, for some of them, they actually saved for a down payment on a house. And this is, I think, one of the really interesting data points that we are seeing is that there is an increased share of young adults who have moved home and are moving directly from their family member's home into home ownership. Now, this is certainly not something that I, as a young adult, that was not going to be available to me. I certainly wouldn't have done it at all. My family is in Seattle and I am in the DC area. So that is certainly not something that was out there for me as an option. That being said, for my little sister, she absolutely did move to my basement. She saved for a down payment. She paid down her student loan debt. She worked on her debt to income ratio. She really scrimped and saved, and she was able to buy a home just in the last couple of months. So that has been very impressive to see. And there's a lot of young adults who are doing that. I tried to charge her rent. It didn't work very well. That being said, if we look at this just overall, what we can see is that back in 1993, it was the lowest share of young adults who moved directly from their family member's home into homeownership, and now we have 21%. It's not the highest we've ever recorded. The highest was in 2019, but this is something, I'm seeing a lot of chats, so I'm really nervous and scared of what's coming into the chat box. Hopefully it's not destroying me right now, but this is something that if it's available, we certainly are seeing this happen as well. All right. Okay, let's talk about student loan debt. We have done research on this for a very, very long period of time at NAR. We were one of the first trade associations really out there saying this is starting to impact our home buyers. And it really came from members, from realtors who are out there in our research committee who said, oh my goodness, this is impacting my kid. This is impacting home buyers that we're seeing about 8 years ago. And that's really when this is more of a fringe issue. It was not talked about as much as it currently is right now, certainly not in this environment. Student loan debt, by some estimates, is as high as $1.7 trillion. It is one of the major debts that has increased since the Great Recession, has continued to go up. We certainly know that this is impacting really every age category and has increased for every age category that is recorded. It is not just a millennial issue. In fact, if we look at those who are the oldest generation, which is actually collected data on for this, what we can see is that their student loan debt has actually gone up more than 1,900% since 2004. And those are for individuals over the age of 60. And we know that the student loan debt that they're holding, it's disproportionately for themselves. Most of their student loan debt is for themselves, but some of it may actually be parental plus loans as well. This is a very important issue when we talk about homeownership, we talk about housing, we talk about the ability to save for a down payment and for debt to income ratio. So if we look at this data, the most recent iteration of this that we have put out is in September. And what we can see is the first thing that we can see here that impacts homeownership is the headship rate. So just the ability to move out of a family member's home after you have completed college. And we know that is the first thing that's going to be impacted is just the ability to do that. Can you move out? What we can see here is that for 46% of individuals after college, they are having a hard time moving out because of their student loan debt. It is very likely today with rents that have increased so dramatically, 30 to 40% in some cities around the US, that it's also because of rising rents. But at the time of this survey in September, what we found is that student loan debt was really the big cause of this. For Gen Zers, they were very likely to be impacted at 75%. Now, I will say that for Gen Zers, if they are young 20s and they have graduated college in the midst of a pandemic, they probably just moved back home. And that was probably a choice that they were willing and wanted to make just because of the time frame that we're currently living in. For millennials versus Gen Xers, though, this is where I think it becomes incredibly important and does speak to the disproportionate amount of student loan debt that is held by the millennial generation compared to older generations. And what we can see here is that 62% of them were delayed moving out of their family member's home compared to just 37% of Gen Xers. So we can see a very big jump. This is also an apples to apples comparison when Gen Xers graduated, because I know that some of them are well into their 50s at this point. So it's not talking about them in their 50s, it's talking about them when they were in their young 20s as well. The other big thing and the other big takeaway here is that there is a disproportionate amount of Hispanic and Black individuals who are being delayed moving out of their family member's home compared to white individuals. And when we dig into this data, public record data that is available out there, what we can see is a couple of things. One, we know that Hispanic and Black individuals are more likely to have student loan debt while they attend college. They're less likely to have scholarships. They're less likely to have parental help with education. So they're more likely to have student loan debt. What we also know, looking at data that's not our data, but looking at external data, what we can see is that they are more likely to have student loan debt 4 years after graduation as well, in comparison to their white counterparts. So they're having a harder time paying down their debt after college. And that's really important when we do look at this. Not only are they taking on higher student loan debt balances, but they're having lower earnings after they graduate. And because of that, they're just having a harder time tackling that debt. When we look at homeownership, what we can see is that for half of non-owners, they're saying that their student loan debt is delaying them from purchasing a home. That jumps to 60% for millennials. It also jumps importantly here to 60% for those who are making $100,000 or more. Why this becomes so important is I think that for those who are making over $100,000, they're actually saying homeownership should be within reach. I should be able to obtain this. I am a pretty good income earner, and this should be something that I should be able to obtain, but they're having a harder time actually getting there as well. For those who are earning under $50,000, it could be because they are actually not likely to even have emergency savings. So that would be very difficult for them to consider purchasing a home today as well. All right. One of the big misconceptions that's out there is what the typical down payment is. And I threw that in here because if there is any way that you can help dispel this myth, I think that it could only help first-time homebuyers and young adults today. One of the big things that's out there is that people think that they need 20% down to actually purchase a home. In fact, 35% of individuals who are out there who are not home buyers, who are not currently homeowners, think that they need 16 to 20% down to purchase a home for a down payment. I don't know where this came from. It's something that I don't know where it came from, but it is a myth that is very persistent out there. 10% of people actually think they need more than 20% down for a down payment. When we look at the typical down payment for individuals, what we can see is that for first-time homebuyers, it's been 6 to 7% for the last several years. It's been pretty flat. The highest it's ever been for first-time homebuyers is actually 10% back in 1989. For repeat buyers out there in the market, they're actually not even putting 20% down. And that's even with the increased equity that they have gained through homeownership in the last year, the last couple of years. They're typically just putting down 17%. So we really do see that people are not putting down this big misconception that's out there. One of the great resources that's available to first-time homebuyers out there is looking at HUD.gov. Because that actually has low down payment options and programs that are available on state and local basis. And you can really dig in and see if maybe you qualify for a low down payment program, perhaps as a teacher or other profession, you may be able to enter into homeownership much quicker than you thought that you would be able to. Also, an FHA loan is just 3.5% for a down payment. And a lot of people do take advantage of that. About a quarter of first-time home buyers did use an FHA loan. And so that's a lot more spending cash. That's a lot more renovating or decorating money at the end of the day, and could help individuals enter into homeownership. All right, I want to talk about some of the big demographic changes that we're seeing as well for the last year. The first one, multi-generational buying. We have seen that was a very quick uptick to 15% of buyers as soon as the pandemic started. About 1 in 6 buyers purchasing a multi-generational home. That is back down now to the historic norm, about 11%. We had seen a quick uptick in that, and the number one reason I talked a little bit about already, but it really was to keep elderly parents safe. And people wanted to have elderly parents in their home, an elderly relative, and make sure that they were okay with the pandemic. Maybe they were living independently or in a nursing home, and they moved into a family member's home. After that quick movement happened, we're back down to the historic norm, about 11% of buyers. Now, if we did see an increase today in minority buyers, we would see an increase in multi-generational buyers because those two things do go hand in hand. We do see an increased share of multi-generational buying among minority populations. The other big demographic change that we are seeing today is there is a drop in birth rates in this country. It is a very considerable drop in birth rates. We are actually at a 100-year low, the lowest the NIH has actually ever recorded of birth rates. It's true of every race. It's true of every age category. We are seeing this drop. Why this is important, and I bring this up in a presentation about home buying and home ownership, is that we really are seeing a shift in activity among home buyers. When we look at birth rate or the amount of buyers, the share of buyers who have children under the age of 18 in their home, who purchased a home in the last year, back in 1985, it was 58%. Today, it's just 31%. So that's a very considerable drop. And it's really reflecting this drop in birth rates. This has some big implications. It's going to change the neighborhood choice. So if you don't have a kid and you have no intention of having a kid, certainly you can look outside of that A+ school district. You don't care about that one as much. You may look to these overlooked areas. You also are going to have a difference of home size that you actually need. So maybe you do need that home office now, but that extra bedroom would certainly not be used for a baby's room if you have no intention of having a child. The other thing that it does influence is the number of moves that people are having. So if you have a second kid all of a sudden, or you have your first child, you suddenly need to move to have a bigger home to accommodate everyone within that home. And if you're an empty nester and you suddenly have a kid who's left the nest, you suddenly don't need that big home anymore. And so you could see a shift there as well. So it just reduces the number of moves that people are having as well. I think this is a big implication. I think this is a trend to watch for anyone who's watching these demographic trends. I do think it has some big implications for homeownership. The other big demographic change that we are seeing is a drop in marriage rates in this country. So if we look back at the 1960s, 70% of American adults were married. Today, it's just about half. And when we look at first-time homebuyers, we can really see this trend mirrored. Back in the 1980s, 75% of buyers who were first-time homebuyers were married, and today it's just about half. So we can see this continual decline. On the flip side, what we are seeing is an increase in single women who are purchasing homes. Again, they're making financial sacrifices to get there. They are purchasing on lower household income compared to single men. And so we do see some pretty big financial sacrifices, but they want that stability of knowing exactly what their payment is going to be and those wealth gains that they will have as they own that home. We also have seen a jump in unmarried couples who are purchasing homes today. So I think that's a really interesting trend to watch. So not married legally, but they are actually making this financial investment together for their future and purchasing this home together. We also have seen a Golden Girls phenomenon, roommates who are purchasing homes together as well. We don't see it as much today for first-time homebuyers, but we actually see it among older individuals. So perhaps they're widowed or something along these lines, and they actually just want the companionship, and it helps with affordability as well. So shout out to Betty White. She was ahead of her time. We were seeing it today in the data among our retired seniors out there purchasing homes together. All right, so I do want to talk a little about agent use. I think that this is an interesting trend that we are seeing today, is that even though we're seeing all of these changes in the marketplace, we know that people want a buyer's agent to actually purchase a home with. We see that in 87% of all buyers are using an agent today to purchase a home. We actually see this higher among young adults than any other generation. People really want the skills that an agent brings, and they want their help finding the right home, locking in that home and that contract, but they also really want help negotiating and seeing, maybe it's negotiating time to close, or maybe it's negotiating the home price if they possibly can, or anything else out there, but people do want the buyer's agent to help them through that process. We also see for sellers, they're using agents at higher rates than we have seen in the past. It's actually 90% of all sellers today using an agent. We see for sale by owners selling on your own. It's just 7% today. That is a historic low. We have recorded it as high as 20% in the past. People don't want to leave money on the table. And that's the big takeaway that I have in the data, is that they want a competitive price for their home. They want to sell it within that time frame that they want, but they really do want someone who's going to price that home competitively, and they want an agent to be able to do that for them. There's all kinds of different agents that you can use out there, someone who does a broad range of services versus someone who just lists on the MLS, but it's actually an elevated share today who actually want someone who's going to do a broad range of services, tell them how to fix up their home for a sale, be there before they even list their home, all the way past that closing table as they're on to their next property. So that is what I have for prepared remarks, and I am happy to answer any questions, and hopefully I didn't get too skewered on folks moving back home and not charging my sister too much rent.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica. And we now move to Q&A discussion. Again, as a reminder, please write out your questions on the Q&A function, and we'll get to some questions that were posted during the presentation. So first question is, are there homes available for buyers below 50% AMI? So these would be probably defined as low income individuals. What is the supply demand for them? Do those homes even exist now?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So that's where we're seeing the real lack of housing inventory is for affordable properties right now. Those homes are moving even faster, and some of that has to do with investors coming into the market as well. Some of it's just the vast amount of competition that there is, but it's very, very hard to find an affordable property. One of the things that we have released actually, and we will be updating, is actually looking at how many available homes are currently available on the market compared to each income bracket. So that's something that's going to be updated soon, but is available right now on our website. It's the realtor's distribution curve and income. So I would encourage checking that out on nar.realtor.
Okay. Next question. Do these figures that you presented along rising interest rates signal that this is becoming a nation of renters due to unaffordability of home ownership?
So we still see that the majority of individuals out there do currently own their homes, and they want to own homes if they're not there today. It really is a very difficult place to become a homeowner if you're not already. But with rising rates, what we have seen is really a rush to lock in rates. I have to say too that even though we have rising prices, even though we're facing rising rates, the wealth gains that homeowners have it outnumbers anything that could be there on paper. And if we look at rising rates, we're expecting that rates will rise by the end of 2022 to 3.9%. And if we look at that historically, and we look back to perhaps my parents' generation when they purchased their first home, my mom as a single mom purchasing her first home, I remember her interest rate being something like 13%. So that's pretty incredible, the difference that we're seeing. It's still a very, very low interest rate in comparison to what we have seen historically.
Next question. Do you have any specific data regarding first-time home buyers that are renting out rooms or accessory apartments in their homes in order to help afford their mortgage payments?
Now, I know this is a very popular trend right now. If you can find a home with 2 bedrooms, certainly renting it out to your friend is certainly a great way to go. You become a landlord and you might make a lot of money actually on the end, or at least help with the mortgage. We're certainly seeing this as a trend. I don't have any hard data on that, unfortunately, as a trend.
Okay. General question, why are homeowners not selling their homes, I guess, as much as they have been in the past? Your comment about they're staying in longer.
Yeah, absolutely. People are staying in their homes longer. We have seen that tenure in recent years rose as high as 10 years in home before selling. Now, last year, it actually did drop to 8 years. And I think there's some big reasons behind that. Traditionally, people have moved because something in their life changed. They had a baby or they got married or they got divorced. So all of those demographic changes, they're happening on a lower scale. So those wouldn't be an impetus to move. The other big change is just in the last year compared to 10 years ago, we've seen a drop in people who are moving because of a work change, because you can work remote for so many jobs that are out there. And so that's not necessarily an impetus to move. But people have also locked in low interest rates. They bought more home, a bigger home. And so those types of impetuses are gone as well. That being said, the pandemic changed everyone's life. I think we can easily say that. And so that was an impetus to move in the last year.
Just somebody asking about, do you have any data regarding the Asian population of home buyers?
Yes, that is not in this PowerPoint. But we absolutely do. They do have a higher homeownership rate in comparison to the Black-White gap that we persistently see. The Hispanic gap as well is not as bad as the Black and White homeownership gap. But yes, in the full report, the snapshot of race and home buying in the U.S. available on NAR.Realtor, it is every race and it's in every state as well. So I would encourage checking out the full report and you can see the full experience there.
Okay. What is happening to people that are trying to buy but aren't successful? Are they going back to the rental market or moving on to another area where they can't buy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think it's a mix of everything. I think that for those who are trying to enter homeownership and are having a hard time being shut out of that, they could go on back to renting. Right now, they're just facing rising rents, though, especially in this area. They could be moving into their family member's home, like my little sister did. They certainly may be moving to different areas as well. And I think the remote work trends are probably here to stay. And people may be taking advantage of those and finding more affordable areas.
Just more of a comment. Somebody just wanted to thank you for mentioning the impact of student loans. As an older millennial herself, she wasn't able to buy a home till her mid-30s because of student loans. Question: If the baby boomers are a big generation and demographically they're passing away, why aren't their homes helping the inventory of properties for sale?
Yeah, I gotcha. So not all the baby boomers are dying off. So I will say that um, we are seeing that people are living longer and they're working longer. What we had seen for past generations, the silent generation, the greatest generation, people moved into nursing homes. People moved into old folks' homes. And that was something that traditionally happened if they didn't move into their family member's home and were taken care of by their family. And into a multi-generational home. That's not necessarily happening today. We're seeing that perhaps it is a widow who their kids are all grown up and left and married, or just moved to different areas of the country. And what we're seeing is that she's staying put in that single family home. That is happening a lot in different areas of the country. I will say Minneapolis is one of those areas that this is happening a lot in. And they actually rezoned those properties that are huge single family homes to become multifamily homes because inventory was so needed. So unfortunately, we're just not seeing them die off and sell their homes.
Yeah, and some of our recent programs and work kind of confirm that. So when, we've done some work around senior housing and when somebody goes into like a senior housing situation, that's actually defined in practice as more like you're in close to your 80s. So people are definitely staying in their single family homes much longer. Are there any statistics available breaking down home purchases based on housing type, single family detached, townhomes, condos, and also how does this correlate to age groups?
Yes, absolutely. So we do have that data. Again, nar.realtor, I'll shout out our website. We do collect data on that on a monthly basis, but we also report it on an annual basis in the profile of home buyers and sellers. It's really interesting, actually, when we look at this by age category, what we see is it's more common for older adults. Again, maybe the upkeep, not to actually want to have to worry about the yard, so more likely to purchase townhomes and condos. For young adults, all the way through younger boomers, more likely to actually purchase single family homes. People want their yard if they can find that. That is what they're looking for today.
I guess on my front, I have two related questions. One is on condos. So has there been as much condo buying as there's been proportionally more home buying? And then secondly, traditionally, as a starter home, people used to tend to buy townhomes and condos and then move up. Is that still the case, or is there not enough supply of that, or are people just directly buying single family detached?
So I'll answer the second question first. So more than half of younger millennials, more than half of first-time home buyers are actually buying a single family home first. They're essentially skipping that starter property. And what we had seen in the past is people had planned on staying in their first home, their entry-level home, for 5 years. Today it's 10 years. So some of that, I think, is the hangover effect of the Great Recession. People are saying, I don't think that I'm going to make quick money, even though they really will with the equity gains that people are seeing in home ownership today. But they're not thinking of that as a quick trade. They're settling in for the long haul. They're locking in low interest rates and they're there to stay. So we don't see as much purchasing of that. At the very beginning of the pandemic, answering your first question, we did actually see a drop off in condo sales in comparison to single family singles. Single family sales really booming as people wanted more space. That being said, there's just a lack of available inventory as well, especially in the affordable price point. It's lovely to buy a condo in downtown DC if you can find it and you can afford it. And I think that's where that's really coming into.
I guess there's just a general question about the inventory shortage. I guess I'll couple that with a question on, how do we get out of the inventory shortage? Is that just a matter of just building more homes and trying to find ways to build more homes?
Yeah, I think I could have taken an entire hour talking about all the supply crisis and building shortages that we're having as well. So I will tell you that we do need to build more homes. We need to build more affordable homes as well. So that's a really an increasing problem. Is builders are maybe building and they may be ramping up building in some areas of the country, but it's expensive homes and it's not homes, especially for entry-level inventory. When we look at the reasons why builders are not building, they'll say it's 5 L's. It's now I'll have to remember them that I said it was 5. Labor constraints, they're certainly seeing right now for skilled labor. Lumber, but lumber goes well beyond lumber at this point. It goes to all supply issues from paint to dishwashers, etc., anything that someone's trying to buy. Land, the availability of it, and the cost of lots as well has gone up. But then laws, density restrictions, thinking about, can you have an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, and build that? Can you buy or build multifamily on that lot versus single family? And also thinking about funny regulatory issues, like you need to have 2 parking spots for every home that's built, even though it's going to be owned by a single individual. So things like that are funny laws on the books that become really a problem in some areas.
Okay. Next audience question. There was a slide that showed how various age groups were spending their income. She's particularly interested in the data on spending on food away from home. She thought it was increased tremendously, whereas I guess the data showed it was more or less constant.
Yeah, so that's comparing, I guess, if we look at probably at the most recent year, certainly we do know that there's more spending on things like Uber Eats and Postmates, and ghost kitchens are really being popped up in different areas and being supported during the pandemic. That being said, if we look at those who are under the age of 25 and just looking generation to generation and compare that at the same age, we actually know that it has gone down. So it's not the avocado toast meme that's certainly out there. Maybe those young adults have bought the avocados and making their own toast. I'm not entirely sure, but it's not something that's happening.
A question from the chat. How does culture get into one of the reasons why multi-generational homes are being purchased? So he comes from a Hispanic background. Traditionally, kids stay home until they marry and grandparents live at home with their families.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of why that is more likely to happen. Certainly, it is more common in all minority households. So more common in Hispanic, more common in Asian American households, and more common in Black African American households. We do see more multi-generational buying and multi-generational living. I'm not sure. I think that each culture may have its own reason. Every home might have its own reason why that works for them and why that doesn't. But certainly supporting one another within a house is something that's become increasingly important during the pandemic for everyone, I think.
So one question I had is, there's been some press recently about the number of homes being purchased by investors. Mm-hmm. I mean, the numbers vary, but I think they tend to be fairly high nowadays. So what is the impact of that investor purchase as opposed to the home buyer purchase? What data do you see with that, and what do you see going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we had seen about 15% of the market in the most recent year was non-primary residents. So maybe that's a vacation buyer, maybe that's an investor. If we're looking at mom and pop investors, that may overlap as a definition, because you may have someone who's saying, this is a vacation property, but I'm going to perhaps Airbnb it out or VRBO it while I'm not currently in that property. And then maybe long-term I'll live there as my retirement property. So certainly an overlap in that definition, but about 15% of the market. What I will say is that our chief economist, Dr. Lawrence Yun, he is forecasting that that's going to go up this year in 2022. And the reason why is inflation. He thinks that people may diversify their investments and actually say that real estate is a hedge against inflation and actually could invest in that. So we may see it go up to 20% this year.
Question here: why are there new technologies like 3D printed homes or more manufactured homes that are more affordable to build? Are those potential solutions, or does NAR see any interesting things that are people doing to address some of these issues that you outlined?
Yeah, certainly there's definitely more of an appetite for manufactured homes in some areas of the country, especially the South and more rural areas. It's just more common to have manufactured properties at those areas. I will say that the appetite, the consumer appetite, doesn't seem to be there, even though the technology is very much there for 3D printed homes, for kit homes. So essentially thinking about Sears and how you could build your own home back in the 1940s and 50s. So certainly that's available. It just doesn't seem to be something that's a consumer appetite for those properties.
I guess it's more of an organizational question. Is there any work between NAR and NARED with plans to bridge gaps in white-Black home ownership?
Yeah, so the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. So yes, we have worked with them in the past, and we're continuing those relationships. We actually have a staff member who is devoted to working with, it sounds like it may be a realtor who's asking this, working with NAREP, which is the Hispanic real estate professionals, working with ARIA, the Asian real estate. I cannot remember the full acronym there. There's a lot of vowels, working with them as well as NAREP as well. So the realists, yes, absolutely. Those partnerships are there.
Okay, well, with that, I'd like to thank Jessica for sharing her time this evening and her expertise. Hopefully it was instructional. I know I learned a lot, all sorts of potential impacts on not just consumers, but the real estate professionals working around residential real estate, builders, designers, planners, and what we can all do to address some of these issues and make sure that all of us play a role in helping our society seek shelter, which is the name of our seminar today. So we're up against the time. Let's see, maybe we can do, there's this couple links came on from chat. Okay. Well, we want to say thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. Hopefully you learned something. Again, the recording of this webinar will be available to you. I'll send out the link probably tomorrow. And we will also post that on our YouTube channel for you to share to your colleagues and those that weren't able to make it tonight. So again, thank you very much, Jessica, for spending time and your expertise this evening. I'd like to just have a couple of announcements. One is that we are accepting applications for our Master's in Real Estate Development for fall 2022. For those that are interested, or if you know anybody that's interested, go to realestate.gmu.edu. And we'd like you to consider our next webinar on February 24th, which is High-Rise Wood 2.0, Building Commercial Buildings with Mass Timber. So please shoot me an email or watch out for an email after that. And I'd also like to plug the 2022 Fairfax County Housing Symposium, which will be on March 17th. Again, a full day of talking about housing issues in Northern Virginia. So please watch out for an email for that conference on March 17th. So again, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to our speaker, Jessica, and thank you for participating.